This is an interview by Ryan Tapey to Kevin Tapey on January 18th, 2020 for Mr. Viscariello's 5B class. And the topic of the interview is going to be his life living in Berlin surrounded by the wall and the era of the wall in general, feelings about when it fell, experiences, the how and the why, and his interactions with people inside and out of the wall.
I consent to video and audio recording. In late 1980, about October, my father was assigned from Gunter Air Force Base to Tempelhof Air Force Base in Berlin, Germany. He went ahead of us, and then my mom and I came out in 1981. We arrived in January. It was an interesting city. It was we had to have prior to leaving, we had to have a course on what to do and what not to do, because again, this was kind of like an island of freedom in the midst of, a country in the Iron Curtain. So we had to know exactly what we were allowed to do, what we weren't allowed to do. We were also told that, you might be watched and you have to be very careful as an American living in West Berlin. For me, I was 11 years old, 12 years old, and this was just another base, or so I thought it was. We moved there, and it was a lot different than what I thought it was going to be. West Berlin was a safe, amazing city with lots to do, lots of people to see, and there was no real thought of the wall because you didn't see it. You didn't come in contact with it every day, but I knew it was there because I lived less than 2 miles from it. So I could see it out my apartment window where we lived in military housing, and I would ride to the wall pretty much once or twice a week and go to a viewing stand and just climb up to the top and look over the top to see, just what it was on the other side. Because at the time, the prevalent attitude was that, Americans feared Russians, Russians feared Americans, and that there was this just overwhelming feeling of something was going to happen, or you had something to live in fear of. And of course, I had never met a Russian and didn't know what to think if I ever would meet a Russian. I wasn't sure. So going to Berlin was a lot of unknowns. I went to school there. I went to an American school and had German friends, some of whom had parents who were alive when the wall was erected. And some of them had families that when the wall went up, overnight, their families were split in half, or split just in general, with part of them living on the east, part of them living in the west. And we always heard stories about neighborhoods and even buildings that were just partitioned off by this wall. There were escapes from East Berlin into West Berlin, or East Germany, because it was bordered on part by East Germany. And people often made attempts, but I couldn't figure out how that would be possible, because looking over the wall into East Germany, there were an area of minefields. There was a wide swath of land that was just cleared away completely. And there were guard towers every 200-300 yards. There was a guard tower, and it was always manned by 2 people. And the story was the 2 people who manned it never really worked together all that often, and they rotated people so that they couldn't come up with a plan to escape themselves. And when we would go up to the overlook to look over the wall, they would go hide behind the middle of their tower so that we couldn't photograph them. It was really very interesting. On kind of a personal level, we as Americans were allowed to go to East Berlin, but it had to be with permission of the United States government, one, and with the permission of the East German government on the other, so that we could cross into East Berlin and we could shop, we could eat, we could do, almost anything within reason. It was rather startling to go across on a bus and have, the first person that boarded the bus once you passed through Checkpoint Charlie was usually two Russians. One was a security guard or a security personnel, and the other one was the Russian guide. The Russian guide was always in military uniform. The guard was always in military uniform. and they kind of steered the show from there to where that you didn't end up somewhere you shouldn't be, and also they could kind of control what you saw and what you took pictures of. It was rather interesting. Talking to them, I learned that Russians were a lot like us, which, as a kid of 12 who had heard all these stories and seen tons of James Bond movies, as ridiculous as that sounds, that was kind of my view of what a Russian was. Because, in America, you don't meet them, and, you see on TV or you see in the movies. So for me, it was interesting to find out that, they were almost like us in a lot of ways, and except they didn't have access to things. If you wanted a Russian army hat, they would trade you a pair of blue jeans for it. If you wanted a belt buckle, they would trade you American magazine. They want American magazines, American blue jeans, pantyhose, anything American they wanted, because they couldn't get that stuff in the Eastern Bloc countries, and those who could get it were higher up the food chain than they were. So shopping in the East and just interacting with people in East Berlin was very different. Their style of government at the time was that you pretty much worked. Everybody worked, whether that job was maintaining the clean streets, working in a shop, working in a restaurant, or whatever. Everybody worked. That was the first place I'd ever experienced a bathroom where I went in and you had to pay to use the stall, and then there was a person in there that cleaned it up immediately when you were done using it, and you had to tip that person. And I gave one of them a $5 bill because that's all I had. The next thing I know, she pulled out a cold drink for me, and she gave me a hot towel. It was interesting because the exchange rate was 10 to 1, so I had given her, in essence, 50 East German marks instead of, a tip that was more reasonable. In the West, it was interesting because in the West there were individuality was the thing. I mean, it was nothing to get on an underground train, or the U-Bahn as we called it, and ride with people with spiked green hair or business people or whatever. I mean, it was just like being in any American city. You saw all kinds, all walks of life on the train and out in the economy. It was a Western city. It was a vibrant Western city with all kinds of stuff going on. Whereas East Germany, it sounds strange, but it's almost like that in The Wizard of Oz. The movie starts out where it's black and white. And to me, that's how East Germany looked and felt when I was there, was black and white. And then you went to that part in West Berlin where it was all of a sudden it was in color. The yellow brick road, the house, everything. It was all color in the West, and it just seemed much more alive. Were East Germans happy? I don't know. I don't know if they were happy or not, but that was my perception, was they weren't. That there wasn't this happiness and joy like there was in the West. It was a stark contrast. And I remember in 1991 in November when I got the news that the wall had come down and it was coming down in pieces, and there were celebrations all over the city. All I could think of was, wow, how is this going to change not just Berlin, but the entire country? Because again, it had to be culture shock for those in the East to come west and find out kind of how they'd been living. And, I would love to go back today and see what it looks like. I met lots of wonderful people. It was just such a wonderful experience for me to see that kind of contrast between peoples. And really it was eye-opening because I found out that, that it was more of a government against government thing than it was people against people for the Cold War, because the Russians that I met, the East Germans that I met, were all very nice people. It was just such a different experience, and it's one that I'm glad I had. But the Berlin Wall, the fact that they put that up to kind of prevent that view of freedom from people, and that, that and they wanted to choke out the West in a way, and I'm glad they didn't, because it was great. It was really enjoyable.